Okay. Let's discuss SPI's Tannenberg. This was the S&T component to go in conjunction with the Quadra game, Great War in the East. And it uses, like all the Quadra games do, the same basic rules. And I want to focus actually a little bit more on those basic rules because I think that's kind of the more interesting factor. Tannenberg itself, though, is an interesting game. And just in terms of where the review lies, because I think it'll just be more helpful. And I'm not sure. Something makes me think that ISB put out some other World War I games after SPI, but maybe I'm mistaken there. That's the designer. Because this is an interesting system. So, what is... There's nothing, that really jumps out and says, oh my god, this is so different, except maybe the combat results table. And it really isn't that exciting. But in terms of how the pieces work together, there is something kind of neat about it. So, for example, being able to choose your attacks, and that was a little different in terms of this era of game. Usually you were forced into attack. Zones of control were much more fixed than they are in this. In a sense, this doesn't feel like World War I, which is kind of worrisome because of those fluid zones. You can walk right through an enemy piece. Why World War I would do that and World War II tended to use locking zones? That seems strange. But of course, if you have a continuous front, that's not going to happen. And there's some nice things that might come of that, which is you have to leave weaknesses in your front. I guess kind of the problem, though, is there's very little... There really isn't an incentive to have that solid front that you would have that prevents any infiltration, at least in the early era of the war. Not this era of the war. This is pure mobility here. But once you get to, I don't know, the mid portion of the war in the East, you feel like there should be fairly solid lines at one point. And I just don't feel like the system really rewards that at any time. Now, it may be that, hey, that didn't work. If you had penetration with Strasstruppen or something like that, or just a local break in the line, you wanted more the in-depth defense. So in a sense, the game sort of rewards all the lessons of World War I, maybe, without really necessarily putting you in the proper position. Now that's fine for 1914, and I'm speculating about the rest of the Great War in the East series. I haven't gotten a chance to play it. I'm interested in it, because this system does provide some kind of neat aspects to it. What about that little combat chart? That's kind of cool, isn't it? First of all, this is one of the earlier games that I've seen that kind of cross-references multiple factors in here. So you've got your odds chart, but baked into it, you've got the tactical quality rating, which, is kind of not many different numbers in any particular scenario. So that that could just be shifts to an odds chart, and it would work just the same, right? But okay. If it had a comparison of the tactical qualities baked into it, that would get more interesting, but I don't know. But the results on the combat table, which result in these options, is also kind of different from what I've seen, especially since the defender always kind of has this option to retreat, but the attacker's always going to take losses. I think I've seen games that take that base idea into play. The defender can choose retreats, but usually if the defender retreats, that lessens the intensity of the battle, and that doesn't happen here. You break the defender, you take heavier losses. I'm not sure how reasonable that is. I kind of like if the defender chooses to retreat, the attacker wasn't attacking as long, so he's taking less. Okay, so one of the biggest criticisms I have for this is the amount of kind of administrative overhead during the regular turn. You're constantly worrying about stacking points. Okay, big deal then. You have to add up your, figure out your CRT odds result perfectly to optimize your play. All right, we're used to that, right? Except for one big thing. Because you have the option of attacking when and where you like, well, in some senses that makes it easier because you don't have to balance necessarily a whole bunch of attacks at once. So I guess actually that does lessen the burden of the CRT table. It felt like a lot to me though. And then these command ratings, and of course there is an option to say, hey, if you're in command radius, you're in command, that's good enough, don't worry about it. And it probably would be the more fun way to play. Worrying about the command strength, how many stacking points any given officer can command, it's kind of a nightmare of counting. I didn't really bother with it with Masurian Lakes because the Germans had enough points. It was clear. You had stacks, every stack seemed to have its own corps commander who had about enough points to command almost any size stack. He could command 7 stacking points, you can put 9 in a space. And then you had somebody like Hindenburg, and you had, I think, 2 other army leaders there who can all, probably, Hindenburg can probably command the whole field with his 8 range and 45 stacking points. Probably close to it. So the Germans had a serious excess, and the Russians very quickly, I mean, turn 1 they're immune from it, and very quickly they didn't have enough stacking points to be worried about it. You do have to worry about getting cut off though, and this is really a game about encirclement and pocketing units and destroying them that way. I feel like the Masurian Lakes more so than Tannenberg. Tannenberg, there's this constant ability to kind of slip out of that noose. We saw that with Samsonov in my play. I wasn't used to that because I played against people who I guess, weren't as comfortable with these kind of games more recently. So like, by more recently I'm talking in the last 20 years. In fact, all my non-solitaire plays. After playing at solitaire and having the Germans lose completely, I'm beginning to flip back to my old thought of the game, which is the Germans can probably stop the Russians by just not taking risks. I'm saddened that I didn't get to test that out, and I don't really, want to play this again anytime soon. Overall, I think it's a pretty solid game for its time period, but it's got these little annoyances to it in terms of the mechanical upkeep especially, that I think that it's not going to be terribly attractive to too many people. It makes a good kind of mid-level. So if you're at this point in my life, I'm kind of into I want something really light, or I want something really heavy, really big, and I kind of fluctuate between them. I was able to pick this up more in the really light status, and it was a little too mechanically annoying for that status for me. But it does serve in kind of an intermediate step. So if you're working your way towards heavier games, this isn't a bad choice. It doesn't have too many complex ideas in it, but it does have some things that you have to think about in it that maybe you don't have to think about, in, I don't know, No Retreat. You have a lot to think about in No Retreat. There's no question there. But this has more sort of procedural and mechanical aspects that impact your play that you have to take into account as a whole. I don't feel like that happens in something like No Retreat. I feel like in No Retreat, you're optimizing your whole field strategy, or maybe a very small piece. Here, you've got kind of this broader operational level in there. Now, yes, No Retreat's actually probably a strategic game, if anything. Although I think of it more as operational just because, well, it doesn't include the stuff strategic games that I love include, which are more the grand strategy games, anyhow, which usually have an operational system behind them for the field, for handling the actual battles. But this, to me, strikes me as sort of a, as more of a stepping stone in the direction of the more complicated games like, say, the OCS, where you have lots and lots of these subsystems that you have to worry about, command and control type things. Actually, you don't there, I don't think. But, you know, you have much more detailed supply rules that you're worrying about. And then the air and this, that, and the other, where you have to kind of piece them all together on a broad, across-the-board type strategy, as opposed to just a few pieces that you have to think real hard about. And this is something that might make a good example, and there are many, many of these, by SPI especially. This is towards the start of the period where they are. If you get Desert Fox, which I always bring up because to me it's the progenitor of the OCS, really, has a lot of that factor, of course, and the standard combat series as well. There's no question that serves as that step as well. It may actually require less thought in terms of that really agonizing decision that you have to make in a no-retreat type game, but it's adds up to what feels like more to me. Maybe not more thought, but more gravitas in the game itself. Anyway, that's what I have to say with this. I've got to go to work because I hear my little alarm going in the distance.